In video 3, we talked about phased reopening and that what we needed to do if you wanted to reopen safely was wait long enough to get the information back so that we knew what we were doing was the smart thing to do. So in video 4, let's talk about the summer wave, the big COVID wave that came through this summer, and kind of what we needed to do and what we maybe can do in the future to notice that this is happening earlier, right? So my concept for this video is that the only way to effectively intervene in a new wave of COVID is to take subtle early warning signs seriously, right? Last time we saw that things were getting more dangerous and we didn't see that that was happening until we were basically through some of the most dangerous parts of the summer. So if you wait until new cases, hospitalizations, and deaths increase before you do anything, you've essentially let this wave of COVID run its course. Okay, so if you are leadership and you are asking, well, where's the new cases? Well, where's the hospitalizations? Well, where's the deaths? All you're doing is deflecting so that you don't have to do anything. Okay, so let's walk through this wave. And we're going to pay special attention to one, early warning signs, places where we should have or could have realized that something was wrong. And let's also look at how our leaders reacted to these things, okay? So this time we have a new indicator because we started getting hospitalization data back in April. So in the first bump, we didn't have hospital info, but now we do. So this yellow line is COVID beds. Okay, so the number of COVID beds, and then of course everything's normalized on this 0 to 1 scale so that all the peaks match. There are a couple of different hospitalization indicators, ICU occupancy, ventilator occupancy. They tend to rise and fall about the same time, and so I'm just going to use COVID beds for this, okay? So we talked about reopening last time, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but here at the beginning, we're starting to get into phase 2 reopening, right? So childcare gyms reopen. Bars, bowling alleys, restaurants, and you see, okay, if you're looking at the indicators, cases are going down, hospitalizations are going down, like it looks like everything's moving in the right direction. However, when we look at the exposure curve, which of course, remember, once again, we can't see that until we're quite a bit out because that's historical data. But when we look at exposure, it's starting to go up, even though the indicators that we have access to look like they're going down. So at this point, we have Dan Patrick. Remember, we talked about how dangerous it is to politicize a pandemic, saying there is no reason you should be worried about voting if you've gone to Walmart. And straight up, this is a scam by the Democrats to steal the election. So you've got your leaders, for the first time, really saying that COVID is a scam, COVID is a hoax. And so, of course, for some people, that's going to really change the way that they behave. And things get more dangerous. So moving on, we get Memorial Day and the death of George Floyd. So again, like I said in the first video, we can't trace cases back to any one event, but we know that this was big because we know that there were big parties, there were lake parties, there were barbecues. We know that people were going back into restaurants, but we also know that COVID was spreading at protests. I mean, it's absurd to say that it wasn't, but the more masks you have, the more outdoors you are, the more space you have, the lower the risk. But of course, all of these things are opportunities to spread COVID, especially when you start putting people in jail. And so, of course, all of these are engines. We keep moving on with reopening. Food courts, water parks. You remember this? So about a third of the way up our exposure curve, this was really the height of kind of the civil unrest of the early summer, if you'll remember the whole tear gassing at the White House sort of deal. However you feel about that, I think that you probably remember that as a bit of a reference point for how long ago we're talking about when we talk about the beginning, the onset of the summer wave. We're still in May, okay? So then we get into reopening 3. So almost all businesses can operate at 50% capacity. And look, new cases in ICU, or COVID beds, they look fine. It doesn't look like there's any problem. But our exposure is going up and up and up. More and more people are being exposed, and now people are starting to feel ill onset. So here on the 10th of June, we get our first early warning sign. And that would be that Texas hits a new daily high for COVID cases. Now, it's not mandatory that Texas hits a high before Denton hits a high, okay? But in this situation, Denton and North Texas were not the region that was blowing up first. The first region was Houston and South Texas. When we see our state or our neighbors start to struggle to set records or to see problems in their ICUs, we need to assume that that's floating around our community too, okay? So this should have been a moment for Denton County to go, whoa, okay, it's here. It may be down south a little bit, but it's here. And we didn't. Instead, we expanded restaurants to 75% capacity after hitting a state record in new cases. And then we get a new early warning sign, the second one, which is that here in Denton, our local new cases were increasing for 1 week straight. Okay, so for the first time, we see this uptick that we can notice in our new cases. This should also be an issue. And we start to see our exposure curve flattening. I believe that Denton residents were paying attention to this and saying, oh, well, that's a concern, and changing their behavior. So as we move through, Houston and South Texas are struggling more with their hospital capacity, and Governor Greg Abbott is telling us not to worry about it. Don't worry about it. But what I want you to look at is we in Denton, when he's giving these assurances, are a month out still from our peak hospital peak, okay? So their assurances mean nothing because I don't think they understand the timeline, or they're not speaking honestly if they do understand the timeline. If you don't shut things down, you will see things ramp up for a month. And I was making this case back in June. I was, told I was a fear monger or whatever, all these things that they say against scientists. All I'm doing is reading the patterns and telling you what the patterns are, okay? Yes, I have gypsy blood, but I'm not having to tap into that. This is just statistics. My hope is that our leadership doesn't understand this, and when they do, they will stop talking like this. So, even though the state's hitting records, even though South Texas and Houston are really struggling with ICU capacity, we go ahead and open amusement parks on June 20th, okay? And now, by June 22nd, COVID beds are increasing for 1 week straight in Denton County. So this is another warning sign. We've got a bunch of people going to the hospital. This is a concern, okay? Now, at this point, the people, the Denton, seem to have changed their behavior. The community seems to have recognized that there's a problem. However, our leadership is still refusing to do anything. This is a quote that I find very difficult to accept from the Denton County Public Health Director. It's important to note that all of us need to take responsibility for our health and not advocate that to others. If you are the head of public health, you are the head health advocate. It is horrifying that you would say something like, not my place to advocate healthy behaviors to other people, okay? So he's very much in this, well, it's individual responsibility. And right now it is being run as individual responsibility. And that's why we keep having these waves, and we will continue to have these waves because there is no leadership on this, okay? So, well, at the state level, they realized there's a problem on the 26th and they shut down bars. The city passes a mask mandate. A little while later, a couple of days later, the state passes a mask mandate. Of course, by this time, as we know, our exposure risk has already started to fall because people are behaving or acting right. All right. But the damage is done. Okay, so you can put the mask mandate in, you can close the bars down, but you've done it too late. The damage is done. Now it has to run its course. And all these people have to go to the hospital and get sick and die because basically nothing was done. Judge Andy Eads, okay, who refuses to put a face mask mandate in and says, I believe the situation does include wearing a mask, but it is about much more than a mask. It's about a temporary lifestyle change, which I agree with, but can't be done for most people unless leadership takes an active role. And Andy Eads has refused to do that. So we're being told once again that all of this is our fault. And this is a really great way for leaders to try to deflect blame from themselves. So peak COVID hospitalization happens on July 17th. Okay, this is 18 days after symptom onset peak. 28 days, almost a month after exposure peak, and 2 full months after the exposure risk started to increase. All right? So again, the COVID timeline, especially with our crappy surveillance apparatus, is extremely long. Peak case announcement comes about 2 days later or 5 days later. Again, more than a month after the peak exposure risk, okay? So like I said in video 2, we see this seesaw between case announcements and exposure risk. And we can assume that as soon as our case announcements start to go down, our exposure risk starts to increase. I can't show that with this data right now because our surveillance is so far behind. But I don't think that that's a bad thing to think about, okay? When people feel like it's safer, they act like fools and it's less safe. When people feel like it's dangerous, they act better and it's more safe. Again, this is a difficult feedback loop. Peak mortality happens the same time as peak case announcement. That's how far case announcement is behind. Okay, even back then, and it's become more behind now. So people, basically, we can expect that it's going to be a month between the exposure peak and the mortality peak. People take about, on average, three to 4 weeks to die of it once they start feeling sick of it. So, yeah. So, Kate, there was this other statistic that came out back in the late spring, positivity. And this was supposed to get us all out of jail free, right? Abbott made all of these rules based on positivity, and our schools have a lot of rules based on positivity. So is positivity a helpful measure for measuring infection in the community? Well, let's take a look at what positivity did during the summer wave, okay? Now, this is the DCPH model, so the Denton County model, also how the state calculates positivity. The way they calculate it is with no lag in it. So it's this week's new cases divided by this week's new tests, okay? Now, if the cases are coming back 3-4 weeks after they test, there's no matching there, but that's how it's done. So before I get started, I will say that from the beginning, I have been against using positivity as a metric at all. But let's just see, like maybe it was helpful, maybe it did something for us. So the first thing I want you to notice is that it's actually lowest during the rapid increase in exposure period in early June. Which at first might make you think, well, that's useless. But this actually makes sense, okay? That positivity, the way they calculate it, would do this. And the reason is because of this no lag way that they calculate it, okay? So it's this week's results over this week's tests. So there are 2 ways to decrease your positivity, like we just saw on the graph. One is to reduce the number of positive cases. Now, that certainly wasn't happening during this time period. The other is to increase the number of tests administered, and that is 100% what happened. So, as more people started feeling sick, they started going and getting testing. So our test numbers increased really rapidly, but our case returns weren't at first. So you have a small numerator over a large denominator, and so our positivity falls really fast. However, that didn't last very long, because as soon as results started coming back, you saw it bounce back up. So positivity quickly rebounds, and then for this period I've highlighted here, it kind of follows the shape of the symptom onset curve. Okay. Then when symptom onset starts to come down, now it follows the shape of the new case announcement curve. Okay. So it's like a Frankenstein indicator. And it lags a few days behind even new case announcements, which, as you know, are an extremely lagging indicator. So, yeah, the peak positivity was actually 5 days after new cases, 5 days after mortality, and 40 days after peak exposure. So my argument here is that no, positivity didn't give us very much information on how infection rates or how the epidemic is progressing at all. Now, positivity is a okay indicator to follow to figure out if something weird is going on with your testing, but I think people have invested way too much into this statistic because they don't understand what it is and they don't understand how it works. But if you are running some kind of emergency operations or contingency plan or whatever, I wouldn't base it too much on positivity, okay? So, that is what I wanted to cover with the summer wave, and in the next video, we're going to talk about whether we're ready for what comes next.